Welcome back to Family Twist. Today, Kendall and I are acknowledging the milestone of 150 episodes in 3 years. It's kind of crazy.
And when we first started this, we talked about our dedication and that when we said to listeners that we would have a weekly episode, that we would actually stick to that. And so I'm really proud of us for doing that. It isn't easy. We love it. Don't get me wrong. We love it. And we get a lot of satisfaction, but it is a commitment. And we take that seriously because we know that we as listeners of other podcasts, we want to know that the next episode's coming out, and we love that regularity. So I think that's something I'm really proud of for us. And when I say us, I mostly mean Corey because he does so much of the behind the scenes work.
One of the challenges has been sort of this feast or famine when it comes to guests. It just seems like I'll do some research and reach out to people, and then all of a sudden 8 or 9 schedule within a day or two. And then, on the flip side, sometimes you reach out to a bunch of people and you hear back and they say yes, and then they never schedule or stuff.
It's true. It's true. And again, we're committed to the consistency piece. So for us, it's important not to miss episodes, not to disappoint guests, that sort of thing.
So as you know, if you've been listening since the beginning, when we started this, it was really to tell Kendall's story about his adoption at birth, and then years and decades later, us finding his birth family through a DNA test. From Kendall's story, this whole thing has grown into something bigger, connecting the adoption, DNA discovery, donor conceived, and NPE communities, which all of those communities have kind of embraced us, and we really appreciate that.
For sure.
While every guest story is different, we do find unique elements that sort of connect all of us. And so, there have been some themes popping up over the last 3 years. And I think one of the main ones, and it's become our tagline, is family secrets are the ultimate plot twist. And so, I've always thought of Kendall's story as sort of the yin and yang because he knew from as early as he could remember that he was adopted. It was never a secret. It was never a shameful thing. Even though he was in a small community, his adoptive parents connected with other adoptive families. And so it never felt like a weird thing to him. And then on the flip side, we come to find out that Kendall has always been a dirty little secret for his birth mother. And that's something that just keeps popping again and again on the show. And I think, everybody's kind of come to that consensus of the dangers of family secrets. And even though some of our guests have recognized that, sometimes they're still keeping their own secrets as well. And it's painful. And it's just, okay, well, what do I do? Do I put everything out there and risk losing a relationship with a family member? Or do I just keep this inside? And I can't imagine that internal struggle.
Yeah, it is. It's something I never, ever expected. I thought that when we discovered both sides of my biological family in 2017, I expected a kumbaya moment where everybody loves me and we all become involved in each other's lives and try to catch up on all the, 47 years of missing each other and that has happened overwhelmingly, but not completely. I never expected that I would feel like somebody's dirty little secret. I just never, ever thought that was going to be part of my story.
So something we found through dozens of guests is that the healing really begins when the truth is acknowledged. And it can be painful, but at the same time, I think there's some sense of peace with it too, or just like a sense of, okay, I've overcome this obstacle in my journey. And
yeah, I mean, what I can say, I think that relates to that is that for me, acknowledgement is everything. You don't have to like me. You don't have to really engage with me. But the fact that my birth mother still acts like I don't exist is not okay. It's not okay for me. It's not okay for my sisters that, would like to have relationships with me. It's just not fair. And because I don't need anything from this woman, I had a wonderful mother and I have no misgivings about that whole situation. But not being acknowledged is, it's unfathomable to me. She can accept it for everybody else except herself. So I don't know if she thinks she's better than others or that there's just an expectation of a matriarch that she wouldn't have had that experience. But you can't make me think that it's okay. And many, many people in my lives very innocently have said, well, you don't know what she was going. No, I don't know what she was going through. And I don't expect to understand it. But this was 1970. Put your big person pants on and own your shit.
So that was not really the direction that I thought was coming. But here's the thing. Obviously, no matter how many years have gone by, and it's been almost years, and 3 years since we've been doing the podcast, the wound is still raw. And I think it is for a lot of people, even after they've come to that, they've gotten that moment with a parent, even if it was just fleeting, even if it was just a letter saying, I acknowledge you, I'm glad you're having a good life, but, I just can't be part of it right now. You know, having that, I think, is helpful, but, the wound is still there.
Yeah.
For sure. I do want to acknowledge the Right to Know organization that we become friends with, going back almost to the beginning of the podcast. And I actually joined their board of directors this year as sort of the supportive spouse role. And because it still floors me when people tell stories about their spouse or good friend or other family members say, okay, well, it's been 2 years. You're still talking about this. You're still feeling this way about that. It's, oh boy, just because you don't understand exactly what somebody's going through.
Agree. I mean, I don't know how I would deal with this whole situation if Corey hadn't been so supportive of me, because I need somebody to talk to about this. I need his, and I hate to say it, almost constant reactions to my crazy feelings. I mean, I can go in 5 minutes. I'm doing it right now, quite honestly. I go from having so much empathy for what my biological families went through at the time that my mother was pregnant, to feeling really shut out and distant and devalued, quite honestly. And I don't appreciate that. Corey will tell you, anybody who knows me will say that my adoptive parents raised me to have a lot of pride in myself, to have a lot of self-respect, and I've never had self-doubt. And that's attributed to them. So it was such a crazy feeling for me to feel rejection at the age of 47, right? I don't feel that way outside of this situation. I have had wonderful experiences with friends, and then Corey's family accepted me so warmly when we got together 20 years ago. And so I just had this delusion, and I've said it many times on the podcast, delusion that my birth family situation would be like other relationships that I've had, and it has not been. They have not been.
And I will protect Kendall, no matter what, and I've always felt that way. But I feel like since we've started doing this podcast, it hasn't necessarily made me feel more protective of him and his journey, but it has made me feel like I want to protect our guests and people in the community. And it's just made that sense, that thought of like, how could you not be a supportive spouse?
Right.
It just made that stronger. And so I do, try to like tread lightly, because I'm not a doctor and I haven't been through this personally, aside from, sharing Kendall's journey. But I do like to offer, words of encouragement to our guests, maybe a tiny little bit of advice here and there if it's something that I think is appropriate. But yeah, I feel very protective of these communities.
I do too. And I think I've said this before on the podcast, but I was surprised at the strong emotions that other people's stories have stirred in me. I feel protective of our guests too. I feel like when people tell me stories about how they've been rejected by birth family and things, and often those same people have a lot more grace about the situation than I do. And I'll just tell them, and we might not even put it on the air, but I'll say, I'm pissed off for you. And you have every right to be angry. And you have every right to call that person out. And you know what I mean? Maybe, maybe I'm living, through them, through their experiences, but I just feel so much empathy now, having dealt with it myself. I think it's just given me a sensitivity that I never thought I would have.
You have a right to know where you came from, you have a right to know who you are, and no one can tell you otherwise. And I know that's hard for some people to accept and speak out about, but I think the more that this community grows and the more that we do outreach and find people who don't know about these organizations, they're not on the Facebook support groups. They just don't even know that they exist and they're going through this alone. We're trying to help reach more people so the community can get stronger together. We've had a lot of guests say that, I didn't lose a family through this, I gained one. And it's through community, it's through these organizations, the retreats, the summits, the virtual meetings. It's all important. And I think we feel like we're a part of this community. We feel like we've gained dozens of new friends over the last 3 years through this. And I feel like there's just people that we could reach out to just because, I was just thinking about this. I wanted to reach out. And there's like a handful of people that are coming to mind immediately. I interact pretty frequently with Ryan, who was conceived and has gone on pilgrimages to meet a lot of his half siblings. They were in town a handful of months ago to meet some folks, and I went out and met Ryan, and we had coffee together and a nice hug. And it's just like, that's not something that I think we predicted would come from this podcast.
A strong connection now to my ethnic identity that I never thought would be important to me. So, in other words, if you asked me 10 years ago, when I knew nothing about my biological family, where's your family from? Well, I would quickly say, well, I was adopted, but I felt, because my adoptive family would talk about the fact that my father's mother came from my adoptive family's father's mother came from England, and his father's family was a mix of Europeans and Native Americans, and that my mother's family came over from Italy. It was interesting to me, and I wanted to relate to them, but you always feel kind of like an outsider because, the European thing is true for me, but really nothing else. And so, you just don't know what you should identify with. And now knowing the real story biologically for myself is important. It gives me a sense of pride that I never thought I would have. And I love geography, and I've always loved geography. And now knowing specific regions where my biological family came from in Europe is just so cool to me. And there is something magical about finally finding that and feeling rooted somewhere.
Going back to the early days of our relationship, when Kendall and I were thinking about, do we want children in our life? Spoiler alert, no, we don't have any human children. We have the furry kind, which works for us.
For sure.
But, when we were having these discussions, 15, 16, 17 years ago, Kendall was pretty adamant about adoption being the way to go. And I think that's because of his personal experience, and how it was just wonderful, even though it was short-lived because his parents died young. Otherwise, it was a great experience for him and his family. But my opinions have started to evolve about it, the way I think about adoption, especially after meeting people who did not have great experiences or who advocate for family members taking in someone as opposed to just,
right,
taking them away and having them, adopted.
Well, something that relates to that from my past is that I remember being a small child and already knowing that I was adopted. And I would say things like that to my parents. I would say to my adoptive parents, well, if my birth mom had parents, why wouldn't they try to take care of me? You know what I mean? Like, why I didn't, I already knew at the age of 4 that my mother probably wasn't alone, my birth mother. And so for me, I already had that question in my mind, like, well, what the heck? Why weren't there other people in my birth family that were either capable or, you know, around to take care of me? And my mother, my adoptive mother, was so wonderful. She'd say, well, honey, we don't know. You know, maybe your mom, your birth mother was alone. You know, maybe she didn't have family that she could rely on. You know, it was very real. And they had to give me an answer to my question because I would have never left them alone if they hadn't. But it's ironic because my mother and dad, when they would give me those descriptions, were exactly wrong. They, my birth mother did have a family that could have, and in my opinion, should have taken care of me. I mean, I wasn't alert to know what was happening, but from every story I hear, I just feel like they couldn't be bothered, that they just didn't want to deal with a 15-year-old with a baby. So whatever, I'm making judgments on these people that are dead and gone and I can't ever talk to. But of course I'm going to feel that way, I think. Talk about rejection when you think that you were an infant and your own biological grandmother tells your mother that she has to give you away. I I think that's shitty. I mean, I don't know how else to say that nicely. And hearing people's stories about, how committed these other adoptees are about getting the message out that birth families should take responsibility for their situations. I'm starting to feel that way too. Like, I loved my adoptive parents and I loved both sides of my adoptive parents' families. They were great people and I loved them and I can't imagine not having them in my life. But just when I think about it now, I mean, I couldn't turn away a stray kitten, much less my own grandchild. Like, that's a certain level of disconnection that I hope I never have with humanity.
Yeah, it's, as we found out, it's much more common than what we would have thought of 3 years ago.
Mm-hmm.
And so going back to just reflecting on the podcast itself, our approach has always been with guests to, know a little bit about their story, but not too much, because if we know too much ahead of time, I feel like I like those, those gasp moments that we have with people when we had on the triplets separated at birth. And, there were a lot of jaw-dropping moments in any of these episodes that we mentioned. I'll include in the show notes because that's definitely one that's worth revisiting. I'd actually like to listen to it again. Those sisters are awesome.
They are.
And just hysterical.
And one of them's named Kendall, which makes it even better.
That's true. That's true. So the thing is, we always like to, be on the show together, but that's not always the case. But I will say, on the occasional episodes where I'm traveling or something and Kendall is doing them solo, I really like those because, and I'll confess, I'm very guilty of dominating the questions during interviews to the point where Kendall has to tap me on the leg because he wants to say, or he has a question he wants to ask. So I don't completely take over. And that's the journalist of me. I'll admit that. But those Kendall solo episodes, and I will link several of them in the show notes as well, for you to check out if you haven't already. It's really interesting because it quickly turns into, I think, a therapy session for both parties, for both Kendall and the guest. And there's a couple I'm thinking of specifically that are powerful. There was one that Kendall did with Jennifer, and then I actually met Jennifer in person, the Untangling Our Roots Summit. And she was excited to meet me, but disappointed that Kendall wasn't there because she just wanted to give him a big hug. And she really just gushed over how great he was and how generous he was with her telling her story. Something else we found is that, when a lot of our guests, the story's not over, they're partway through the story. Either they're they're writing it or they've just had this revelation. And maybe the current point where they're at, it's not a happy ending, but there's a possibility of a happy ending. But again, sometimes it's not a happy ending, and because people are gone. That's the thing. Is like, people are, they're getting to the point where they're passing on. Before our guests have the opportunity to connect with them, these family members are dying, and so time is of the essence.
It is, and that it hasn't happened in a long time now. But for the first several years after we found my biological family, I had a recurring dream that my biological mother or something happened to one of us and we never got to speak. And that's becoming more and more a reality for me. I mean, because I've never spoken to her and I don't see that we will. I've gotten more okay with that. I don't know how you ever get completely okay with that. What I think it's done for Corey and me is made us think of other avenues that we'd like to pursue. So, for instance, maybe listeners don't know, but he's a fantastic writer, and I feel like between him and me, we could get a book, that would be interesting. Maybe nobody would read it but us, but that's okay. I feel like A, it would be cathartic. B, it would be another way to have my story expounded upon. But also, it's another avenue for connection to the community.
Absolutely. And yeah, as we continue on, like, we're just kind of trying to keep open to any opportunity. We want to go to more conferences and events, and, like, we're both open to speaking. I would love to figure out how to do Family Twist live, in a small theater. That could be a lot of fun. It's not every story, the entire thing is heartbreaking. There's so many moments of levity, and I think it's really important. And I love drawing that out of our guests because I think laughter is so important for healing.
Absolutely. And shout out to Lauren, whose last name I'm going to slaughter if I try to say it, but
Laducci.
No, you're wrong. But anyway, fantastic New York City based queer comedian who is such a spokesperson for our community. And we need more of that. We need more people who have the platform as she does to, own it and say, you know what, let's talk about this. And she's hilarious. So, that's what I feel like. That's the beauty of this, right? Yes, there are tear jerking moments and I'm getting a little bit emotional right now, but I'm just generally an emotional person, but I also love comedy. So I feel like there are so many things that our stories can bring to the world.
Absolutely. And thank you for bringing up Lauren, because I would love for you to connect with her again, and kind of maybe she could help sort of you add some humor into your story.
Yeah.
At the summit, I attended her workshop, which was about finding humor in your story and being able to talk about it. Just within a few minutes, I wrote a little thing. Everybody got up in front of the class and did their routine. And her advice after I did my little bit was so helpful, and it really reignited that spark in me. I've always been very passionate about comedy, not only writing, but performing. And if Lauren and Kendall and I could work on something together, for Kendall to tell his story with moments of levity and moments of heartbreak, that would be awesome.
Yeah, because I also am a former performer and enjoyed that, and never have done like improv type things at all. But, I feel like I can bring some comedic moments to my story, but I almost need to be prompted at this point. I forget the funny parts. And so I think having a structured idea formulated would be great.
Because as you've seen in this episode, anger and disappointment can come up pretty quickly. The humor, sorry, doesn't come as naturally.
Sorry about that, listeners. I mean, it is real and it's visceral, and I want you to know that this is contrived at all. But there have been so many wonderful, happy moments in my life. So I don't want to discount those. There have been many, many happy moments since I found my biological family. So I don't want to focus on the negative. I've had wonderful experiences with my siblings and my dad and my uncle and my cousins, and wonderful moments. So I am so thankful for this discovery. Don't get me wrong. It's just hard. And you can tell from what I say that just under the first layer of emotion is this resentment I have toward my birth mother. And I don't know that that's going to go away, but it hasn't yet. Nope, that's okay. You know,
Right.
it's a
Yeah.
valid feeling. And when we first started this, I was very apprehensive about voicing that, but then I realized it was going to come out. There was no hiding it. There was no reason to hide it. Especially even 3 years ago, it had been over 4 years since I found my family. So what was I waiting for, right? I was waiting on her to poop on me one more time. I don't think so.
Well, I think it's just time for you to get over it.
Oh,
I'm kidding. See, that's one of those
yeah,
moments of
yeah,
levity there that, yeah.
yeah.
So,
He knows I was about to pinch him.
so earlier we mentioned that sometimes it's a challenge to get guests. There's a feast or famine. Well, we've got a feast coming on. We've got some great, exciting guests lined up. You'll be hearing in the next couple of weeks and months. Very excited about. And yeah, I think there's good things to come. What's really helpful to us and encouraging, though, is your feedback. Constructive criticism is great. Like, we're not so precious about this that we can't take some good feedback and advice. And there may be topics that we just haven't thought of yet. Everybody knows somebody who's got one of these kind of stories, so don't think that, oh, my story's not, it doesn't have as many twists or whatever. No, we want to hear from you. We want to tell every story we can.
Absolutely.
Well, again, thank you for 3 years, 150 episodes, 150,000 downloads.
Yeah.
We really appreciate all of you. And yeah, we're going to keep doing this.
Thanks again.